Hey students, welcome back to week 2 of our online instruction, and today we are going to continue to discuss Native Americans in California history, and we're going to be talking about specifically secularization of the missions and how that impacted the mission Indians. So the textbook information that correlates with this lecture is in chapter 3 of your textbook, and this would be located on pages 56 to 59. So let's begin. All right, so as usual, we are going to start with our lecture questions today. Hopefully these are the answers or the questions that will get answered from this lecture. So the first question is, how does the Mexican Revolution for Independence from Spain impact California? Number 2 is, what is secularization of the missions? And finally, number 3 is, how does secularization of the missions impact the mission Indians? Here you have a list of our key terms. Again, the key terms are the guideposts for the lecture. Make sure that you are paying attention to all aspects of the key terms, including the definition of the key term, and also why is this key term important. You should be able to answer both of those questions about the key terms, and if you can do that, then you should be successful in answering any question on a quiz or an exam. Okay, so we're going to begin by talking about the Mexican Revolution for Independence from Spain, which begins on September 16th of 1810. This is when Father Miguel Hidalgo famously gives a speech about winning Mexican independence for the people of Mexico, for the mestizos population who have been oppressed by an elite Spanish minority for way too long. Of course, Mexican Revolution from Independence is very much inspired by all of the revolutionary movements that were taking place across the world during this time. Of course, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and other revolutions that were taking place in South America, such as Argentina. So there are lots of different revolutions for independence that are taking place, and Mexico is part of this broader movement during this time. It's going to be a long, bloody revolution, but after 11 years of fighting, Mexico will win its independence in 1821. Of course, it's a long and fascinating story, but not one for this class. What we want to focus on in this class is, how does Mexican independence impact California? Well, California is now no longer going to be under Spanish rule. In fact, California is going to become one of the northern provinces of Mexico. So it's going to shift, the government structure is going to shift from one of a monarchy and a Spanish crown and a very strong centralist authority to a less centralist authority, more democratic institutions. At the end of Mexican independence, a constitution is drafted. And also what's going to happen in California is, as a result, the mission system is going to be transformed. And California will also be caught up in the political factions that emerge after the Mexican Revolution for Independence. And we'll talk about that more when we talk more about Spanish California and Mexican California from a colonial perspective. Again, these lectures are focusing on the Native American perspective. So let's get started and find out about secularization. Okay, so once Mexico gains its independence from Spain, the secularization of the mission system begins to unfold. Now, it's a very slow process. So, Mexico declares its independence in 1821. California, because it is such a remote northern province, doesn't actually get news of Mexican independence from Spain until 1822. But it's going to be impacted, particularly in the mission system. Now, this move towards secularization of the missions was something that had originally been part of the law of the Indies. Remember, we talked about that last week. The law of the Indies says that after 10 years, that the missions will be secularized and that the native people that are living within the missions will become part of Spanish society, right? And initially, the Padres working at the missions in California said, no, we need more time. But once Mexico earns its independence, wins its independence from Spain, then the secularization process will begin. Now, what does secularization mean? Essentially, what that means is that the mission lands will be divided up, and they'll be divided up. The lands will be added to the surrounding pueblos. So if a mission was within close proximity to a pueblo or a town, then land would be added to that pueblo. Leftover land would then ideally, I should say, be divided up by former mission Indians and the Mexican government. So the Mexican government will take some, former mission Indians will take some. And then there will be some leftovers that the Mexican government would then divide out in the form of land grants. Another result of this secularization process is that the neophytes, the mission Indians, the baptized Indians living within the mission walls, will be discharged of their mission duties, meaning they can no longer work at the mission, and they would have to leave the missions, right? They can no longer live there. And then finally, what secularization means is that those mission churches would become parishes, which means it's no longer, it's like more like a local church. And even though it remains Catholic, it's no longer part of a particular Catholic order. So in the case of California, it was the Franciscans who were the primary Catholic order, the monastic order that founded the mission. After secularization, that would no longer be the case. In other words, those parish churches would continue to be Catholic, but it no longer would be associated with a particular monastic order. So after Mexico's independence, the Mexican government again begins this process of secularization of these missions in Alta California. What makes the process very complicated is the fact that it is going to impact thousands of Native Americans who are living within the walls of the mission. So why secularize the missions, right? You got a good thing going, you've got this mission system, it seems as if you've got this, pool of laborers. Why secularize it? Well, there were three primary reasons why the Mexican government wanted to secularize the missions. The first was there was a really strong feeling of anti-clericism and the kind of like not an anti-Catholicism per se, but that the monastic orders in particular, because they had been part of the colonization process of Spain, that they were somehow associated with this old order. And these new governments, these more secular governments that were emerging in Mexico and other parts of Latin America, they wanted to have their governments be more along the democratic lines, more in line with the constitutions of the United States, more in line with the Constitution of the French Revolution, right? So all of these things kind of led to this anti-clericalism that spilled over into after the revolution. So the Mexican government really had an interest in trying to strip these monastic orders of their power. Number two, there was pressure on from the Californios to gain more land. And we're going to talk about the Californios in the next slide. Who are the Californios? But basically, you have these residents of California who are of partial European descent. They tended to be the elite of California, and they wanted more land, and they saw an opportunity to be able to profit from the secularization of the missions. And then finally, you have increased Indian resistance to the mission system. We talked about Stanislaus, right? And the fact that he rises up in the 1820s against the mission system and creates this this group, of multi-tribes in California against the Spanish and then the Mexican government there. And so that's just one example of many acts of resistance in the mission system. And so it's becoming harder and harder for the mission system to attract new native laborers, and resistance and uprisings were become more and more common. And this was really destabilizing California. And it also made it so there wasn't a big desire by people in Mexico, or what was before Mexico knew Spain, to travel to California to settle, because they were afraid that the land was overrun by these rabble-rousing, Native Americans. So there was another reason there to secularize the missions, to try to get the mission Indians out into society, or maybe even back to their tribes, so that they no longer were a problem and no longer were, organizing these uprisings. Okay, so I mentioned the Californios, and we will be talking in much greater detail about the Californios again when I talk about colonial California, and particularly during the Mexican period. But many Californios, and these are people of European origin that were born in California. So these are descendants of those original colonizers, the soldiers that came over and were in the presidios, the founders of the original pueblos of the states. And they oftentimes would intermarry with the native population. Many of them were of mixed descent themselves. Many of them were mulattoes. So they were a mixed race population of people, but they identified as the elites of California. And many of them really sort of identified with the political changes that had been taking place on a global scale at this time. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, etc. So some of them really had a very strong sense of locality, and they really wanted to be able to have power and political control of their northern province. Some of them really felt more Californian than they did, Spanish or Mexican, and they identified themselves in that way. And that's why we give them the name Californios. But most importantly for this particular lecture, many of the Californios supported the secularization of the mission lands specifically for economic opportunity and personal gain. Okay, so what you're looking at here is a very faded photograph of the first Mexican governor of California, who will take power in 1825. He is sent up from Mexico City, so in some ways he's kind of an outsider, and he decides right away that he is going to move the capital of Alta California from Monterey to San Diego, because he prefers the weather in San Diego to that of Monterey. And immediately that's going to set off kind of a political controversy and a rivalry between the Northern Californians and the Southern Californians. But for the purposes of our lecture here with secularization, he was the first to discuss a secularization plan and thought about putting it to practice. But unfortunately, he was unable to really get that done during his term because of the political instability and controversy that he created by moving the capital. And so eventually he will be driven out of his position by unhappy Northern Californios. He will be replaced by another governor from Mexico City, Governor Victoria. And again, Governor Victoria will be ousted by angry Californians. So you can see right away that there is a series of political instabilities that are going to ensue in Alta California after the Mexican Revolution for Independence. In fact, it won't be until the governorship of Jose Figueroa that secularization will actually begin, and from 1834 on, it will take actually 11 years for the entire process to be complete. Figueroa's secularization process basically called for half of the mission lands to be divided between the former mission Indians. However, this plan was never fully realized for a number of reasons. First off, many of the mission Indians didn't know that this was part of the official plan to divide half of the mission lands up to them. For their own private holdings. Secondly, the priests did not support that plan. So the priests were actually supposed to take some of the livestock, the cattle, the sheep, etc., that were part of the mission ranching system, and they were supposed to distribute it amongst the mission Indians so that the mission Indians could have their own herds and could potentially make a living from those ranches. The priest, instead of doing that, started selling off the livestock so that they could stuff the coffers of what was called the pious fund, which is essentially what the mission system existed off of. And it went right back into the church's coffers. And then finally, one of the reasons why the mission, the land never made it to the mission Indians, for the most part, with some notable exceptions, which we'll talk about in a minute, was that the Californios themselves were opposed to that, right? They wanted that land for themselves. But ultimately, about 18,000 neophytes, or former neophytes, I should say, who still lived in the missions were impacted by these changes that were brought about with Figueroa's secularization plan. The end result is that 3 major neophyte pueblos will emerge in California during this time, all in Southern California. San Diego, Las Flores, and San Pascual all started as pueblos that were populated with former mission Indians. So for the most part, it was an unsuccessful secularization in terms of the mission Indians getting that land. But the secularization process does get underway in 1834. And as I said, 11 years later, it will be complete. And the missions will be, all of the missions will at that time have been secularized. So what are the results of secularization? Well, as I've already mentioned, although Native people, the mission Indians, were promised half of the former mission lands, most of them were unaware of that fact and didn't get it. Californios will be the biggest benefactor of the secularization process. They will get hundreds of acres, in some cases thousands of acres of land in the form of Mexican land grants from the Mexican government. And they will establish these massive ranchos in California. Some settlers from Mexico will come with the hopes of settling on former mission lands. Your textbook mentions the Padres Hijjar expedition, where 200 settlers from Mexico were, coming to Alta California with the hopes of establishing themselves on former mission land. Although they never did do that, the fact that the missions had been secularized and that there was a promise for potential land available brought more settlers into Alta California. And then finally, for the most part, the ex-neophytes, the former mission Indians, were removed from the secularization process completely. And I mentioned that in the former slide, the reasons why that happened. There were other interests, and those other interests, unfortunately, had a lot more power than the mission Indians, who were always looked at as sort of second-class citizens. So what happens to the mission Indians after secularization in California? Well, first off, even if you had an opportunity as a former mission Indian to get land in these Pueblo communities, the land that was given was very, very small parcels. And many of them wanted to do something besides farm. And they wanted some of them to return to their old tribal ways of life. Unfortunately, for some of them, when they tried to return to their traditional ways of life, they found that the land had been transformed, that many in their tribe had died, that in some cases, a lot of their cultural traditions had been interrupted. So for some people, that was you were unable to do that, right? And so what ends up happening is there's really sort of three different categories of former mission Indians that emerge after secularization. The first is a category of homeless mission Indians that kind of wander around California from one place to another looking for work. Some of them end up falling into alcoholism. Some of them end up falling victim to gambling addictions. So it becomes a problem for a lot of the former Indians, that they no longer have the stability of the mission system to provide them with work and shelter, food, etc. The second category of former mission Indians to emerge would be the category that went to go work for the Californios. And they might work as vaqueros, the cowboys on the ranchos. They might do sort of odd jobs here and there. And typically they didn't get paid actual pesos, but they would get paid in room and board, right? So you would get a place to stay, you would get meals, etc. So that was one way. And also, if you were a woman, typically you could find a job, or may be able to find a job as a housekeeper, perhaps as a nanny for a Californio family, etc. So there were these elite Californio families that hired former mission Indians to live and work on their ranchos. And then the third category of former mission Indians to emerge from secularization would really be a very rare category, but in some cases, these former mission Indians could successfully navigate the new cultural circumstances, in that they could provide, especially if they were fluent in Spanish, they might be able to provide like guides. They might be guides into the interior of California if they were familiar with the landscape. They might be able to be successful in their own right by owning some land or having a successful business. that category of former mission Indians, unfortunately, was in the minority. For the majority of former mission Indians, their fate was either to become homeless, wandering people trying to eke out a living in this new climate in Alta California, or you would end up working for one of these elite Californio families, and that was pretty much it. And so we're going to see the populations of Native people in California continue to decline during this period. And that's going to be a trend that we're going to see continuing for quite some time. So here you have a photograph of former Mission Indians. These are Chumash Indians who had been at Mission Santa Barbara, and once after the secularization, they are forced now to go out into the world and make their way in the world, and they were able to acquire some music skills while they were at the mission. Some of the teachings at the missions included music lessons, and so they're using some of those skills to go out and wander around and play music and try to make money doing that. These are photographs of the missions after secularization. So after secularization, the missions around California, all 21 of them, will eventually fall into disrepair. And in many ways, they almost are forgotten about on the landscape. As we get into the American period, they were in such a state of ruin and disrepair that there were people who lived near these former missions that really didn't even know what they were. The sort of cultural memory of their purpose and their place on the historic landscape had all been forgotten. And what we're going to see is it won't be until we get into the 20th century, into the early 1900s, that you're going to see some people wanting to revitalize the mission, and preserve the missions so that that part of California history will not be forgotten. So if you click on the link that I've provided here, again, not required for you to do this, but if you have some time and would like to watch an additional video, it's about 6 minutes long, and it's, again, some commentators, descendants of Mission Indians, talking about their perspective of what it was like to live on the missions, some of their strategies for cultural survival that they employed in the missions, and how that was carried over down through the generations and still exists to this day through Native oral history. All right, so that was a pretty quick lecture, but that's all for today, and I'll see you on the next one. All right, take care, guys. Bye.